I'd like to welcome you to the August webinar. Thank you for your patience in the fact that we missed last week's webinar and we had to cancel until today or postpone it until today. Our webinar today is about incident response and building an incident response capability. We'll also be talking about incident management, of course, because that's part of your response. Understanding your organization's incident readiness involves understanding how it manages everyday issues and how it determines thresholds for initiating a more formal response. An organization's incident response capability is also impacted by how well it integrates and coordinates the different parts of the organization responsible for responding to an incident. Organizations will benefit from using a common approach for incident management, and this is really going to be the focus of our presentation today. And this enables collaborative work and ensures a more coherent and complementary actions among all those responsible for the response. So today's webinar will discuss the core components of a crisis or incident readiness and how to build a more resilient incident response capability. This is presented by Linda Nelson, the ICOR president, and I serve on the technical committee for the business continuity standards as well as the organizational resilience standards under technical committee 223, which now is 292. Our webinar objectives today include understanding the purpose and importance of building an incident response capability. And secondly, we're going to give you a sneak peek at a new standard that's going to be published sometime soon, I think in the next 3 months or so, which is called ISO 22320. It'll be published in 2018, and it's called Guidelines for Incident Response. This is a standard that has just been updated. It was published, I believe, back in maybe 2007 or 8, and it has been updated, and it's quite improved over its initial version. I'd like to start with a poll. We always like to know who's here today, so let me go ahead and launch that poll. In deferring and rescheduling this webinar, I also lost my assistant who normally runs the polls, so I'm on my own today. So go ahead and clarify, really who you are and what kind of responsibilities that you have, and you can choose all that apply. It looks like just about everybody has voted, so let me go ahead and share the results. Hang on, I shouldn't have done that. Looks like we have about 74% are involved with business continuity or risk management. The next largest group is information security and information technology, followed by a tie for life safety, physical security, and crisis management and communications. A couple of things I forgot to share, and that is if you have, whoever voted other, if you want to use the questions button, or there's a little place where you can ask questions. If you want to go ahead and share in there who the other are, I'm always curious because we try to make guesses as to who our target audience are for different webinars, and so this helps us in our planning phases. Also, just to remind you that as you are attending today, you will have the opportunity to get a certificate with CEUs that will also help you with keeping any of your certifications up to date. And thirdly, if you do have questions, please use the questions pane, and I will do my best to answer at the end of the webinar. Just because I'm on my own today, it might be a little bit more difficult. But for sure, if we don't get to the questions that are posted, I will reply to everyone with those questions, and as well as my answers after the webinar is over. So thank you very much for attending. And we're going to just really talk generally at the beginning of this webinar about the value of an incident management capability. And I would certainly think this would be sort of an duh moment where it is, well, of course you have to have an incident management capability. But in recent years, we've had many disasters, both natural and human-induced, and other major incidents which have shown the importance of incident management in order to, of course, save lives, reduce from harm and damage, be able just to reduce the impact on your personnel as well as the organization as a whole, and to ensure that you have an appropriate level of continuity of operations or continuity of your essential societal functions. So that when we're looking at incident management today, we're going to be looking at this from the lens of an organization, whether it's public or private, as well as through the lens of society as a whole. So we look at regional types of incidents, incidents across borders. You're going to be looking at government. You're going to be looking at certain functions like water and energy and things like that that need to be provided by the society or the community in general. So the applicability of incident management is obviously for life safety. Also, we see it most often, the term incident response with the information security and technology, because everything there is an incident. I'm going to talk more about that shortly. You need to have an incident management and incident response capability for your business continuity, as well as, you would certainly hope when you're dealing with reputation incidents, things that are really hurting your brand, that you would be looking at how an incident management capability for that as well. More and more, we're seeing supply chain incidents, whether they're security related, continuity related, or other factors. We're seeing terrorism more and more around the world. And of course, the natural disasters, which is something most organizations are planning for because they do impact life safety, they impact your facilities, and they impact your business continuity and everything else that the organization has. But what I want to really challenge you about today is to be thinking about the fact that, yes, incident management and incident response can be applied to any one of those individual disciplines, and they should be applied to each of those disciplines, as well as others that, there's really sometimes too many to list. But that we're going to be focusing on today is that you also need to have an incident response or incident management capability that can be used as a shared response between organizations. So whether you have different locations, and you could say that you're a multinational organization, so you might have different lines of business that operate in different parts of the world, you need to be able to have a shared response when something impacts your entire organization. But also when your organization and government needs to be coordinating the shared response, and also between governments when you have things that cross political borders and country lines. So that the challenge here is to have an incident response capability within specific disciplines that can be applied between disciplines as well as between organizations. And this is where we often find that we've built siloed response systems and that they're operating completely separately from each other. And this becomes a challenge all in itself. One of the things I like to do when I'm planning a webinar is to look at what kinds of things are in the news. What are people writing about this topic? So when I looked at this topic, I found mostly information about incident response as it pertained to information and cybersecurity. And for each of these, I've included the reference if you wanted to go read the entire article or blog post or white paper. But this particular one talked about 4 reasons why companies fail at incident response, and it was meant to be about information and cybersecurity, but I'm pretty sure that everything that's talked about there would apply to any sort of incident. And in this case, number one reason is inadequate resources. You don't have the resources that you need, both people-wise and what other resources that you might need. One of the things that's very common in technology world is alert overloads. Everything's an alert. And this is important, so that we understand when is it that something's really an incident. And I remember back when I had little kids, and Sesame Street was something that we always watched, and they had this monkey who was always crying wolf. I'm having an emergency. And so they would, patiently explain what's a real emergency. And then, of course, you have the scene where there actually is one and nobody's paying any attention. And this is what happens oftentimes, is that there's just alert overloads and people don't pay attention to it. Tied to this inadequate resources is this loss of knowledge. People walk out the door and they walk out with knowledge, and they walk out with the knowledge about how to manage an incident, how to identify an incident, what's been done before, and you're now reliant on what you have documented, and you should hope that your documentation is good enough. And the fourth reason that was provided was really this difficulty in measuring success. So one of the challenges that you have is that you're trying to do your daily jobs, but you're also supposed to be responding to different types of incidents. And when you have an incident, one incident to another, they're completely different, and your response is not always easily replicated. And this makes it difficult to measure and to show that you've provided success in the planning that you've done. And this, I think, is a huge challenge to anybody in this industry of trying to make your organization more prepared in whichever discipline that you're representing. And also, when we look at case studies, there just aren't people willing to share the types of incidents that they've had and the challenges that they faced, what they've done well and what they haven't done well. So last month, ICOR published a blog that was talking about an incident at a private high school in Minneapolis that had an explosion. The second piece of that blog will be coming out next week, and the focus of that is it's on its incident response, the planning and how they were able to use their plans and what things worked and what things didn't. And we're actually publishing that blog each month for the entire year through August of 2019. With the intention to try to provide a case study that people can use to as an example of what works and what doesn't and how to learn from that. So one of the things that I found really helpful was a survey that talked about the changing landscape. And even though it was in 2016, I found some examples in 2018 that actually talked specifically about this changing landscape. And, when you're looking at information security, the information security hacker or attacker has been changing their landscape as well. And this idea of once was an era of having these attackers seek to gain access to an environment has been transformed by attackers who quickly smash and grab. They're grabbing your credit card information at global hotel chains, for example, to pilfer millions of credit card numbers. So while we have strengthened our information security, maybe in our financial institutions, our hackers are finding ways in outside of the financial institutions to get the same information. I was also really, I don't want to say the word intrigued, but we don't see on the news today necessarily the types of things that can help us. And here is where in Iraq, they have been targeted by Islamic militants 8 times. That's an average of once a week over the last 2 months. And this is right from the beginning of August, where they've shut down the electricity. And so if people don't have electricity, think about that. If you don't have electricity consistently over the last 8 weeks that you've had power outages that last maybe until the next power outage, how that would impact your business. And this is one way that terrorists and really anyone can come in and shut down a country and shut down the business of that country as well. So not only looking at the government, running of the government, but running of the businesses within that government. And will you want, to do business in a country that can't keep its power up? And we've been fighting with ransomware for years. And this is an article that came out just last week of how they are really increasing their attacks as well as what their demands are. And being held hostage by ransomware is not fun. And understanding how to protect yourself from that is a really important aspect of information security. I also went out yesterday and just looked at what kinds of things had happened since I took a look at this preparing for last week's webinar. And there's a whole bunch of new information coming out about satellites. And this particular one was talking about, Russia as well as China perhaps being a threat in the satellite world and thinking about how we depend on satellites to do lots of our business. And what could that mean if all of a sudden, the new way of attacking a company is by attacking satellites? And we talk about horizon scanning and looking at what's the new threat on the horizon. And I didn't want to be funny about this, but the horizon now might be all the way out into space as we look at what kinds of threats could impact your organization and where you might be vulnerable. But I also wanted to bring us back to land and bring us back home to understand the fact is that most of us are still trying to get funding to manage weather-related incidents. And this is really a challenge, the fact that we're trying to do our regular jobs, we're trying to get our companies as prepared as possible to be less vulnerable and to be able to respond to different types of incidents and be prepared for those. But in reality, leadership gets exhausted by this. And sometimes that overwhelming number of things that we want them to plan for just becomes kind of up against a held up hand saying enough is enough. But if you look at even what's happened in the United States weather-wise in the last month, there's been a ton of weather-related incidents, and we saw just that Puerto Rico is still struggling a year later, even identifying how many people have died, and there's still people without electricity there. So this still is a problem, and it's a problem globally. So let's take our next poll, and our next poll is really asking you, to what level has your organization prepared for that changing risk or threat landscape? So if you could go ahead and vote, we'll just give it a few more seconds. All right, looks like most of you have voted. What looks pretty interesting is that most of you are in the okay level. You use different risk scenarios to plan, and you are moving in that direction. And then we have about an even of people that are not well planned, that you only plan for natural disasters, versus the other ones that you really look at your risk profile and help with that, with about 11% showing that you prepare very well and you feel very comfortable. Hang on, let me make sure I actually close those before I move on so you can see the screen. So what I'd like to do next is to give you that kind of a sneak peek into ISO 22320, Security and Resilience. It's an emergency management standard, so some of the focus is on the more what we would call in the U.S. public sector response, or the response of the government if emergency management is part of the government. But I found that just about everything that was in here was certainly as applicable to the private sector as it was to emergency management. One of our challenges is, or I don't want to say the challenge, but focus of incident management is really been about a local incident. Everything is local, and whether it's based on an address, and that's why we kind of use the Google Map image here, because we're planning out what kinds of things could happen to us at this location. And what we're suggesting to you is that in the future, incident management is going to be much more multi-organizational and much more multinational. There's going to be a need for you to start thinking about how are we going to respond if we're one organization responding, or if all of our organization across all of our locations are impacted. And this is going to make sure that you have to add to your planning aspects, building relationships between different organizations, and also building relationships within countries where you have locations that are within different countries. So factors such as increased urbanization, critical infrastructure interdependencies and dependencies, social economic dynamics, We've been talking a lot in the news about environmental change. We've got animal and human diseases that get heightened with the movement of people and goods across the world, have really increased the potential for disruptions that transcend geographic and political boundaries, and that are going to impact your incident management capability. So my challenge to you is to start thinking about how you can do your planning to consider not just your local venue, but also how you're going to interact with other organizations and with other governments if you're in other countries as well. There are some principles of incident management, and I always feel that principles are really important. It kind of lays out the playing field for what we're talking about. And one of the principles of incident management is this idea of unity of command, and we're going to talk some more about each one of these principles in this webinar. But every person at any point of time should report to only one supervisor. And this is really important because if you've got two people giving you directions and they're not the same directions, how are you supposed to make decisions on what you should be doing? And your organization needs to work together. And this is organizations working together as well as the different parts of your organization working together. So when I talked at the very beginning of the presentation today about having incident response in different parts of your organization working independently from each other, it's really important that your incident response people are working together. In the example in the blog that'll be coming out next week, one of the examples was given that they had their incident response team working on site, and unbeknownst to them, they had their board of trustees working on at a different site, actually at the incident, but a different part of the campus, also working. And while they didn't know that they were both working because there initially wasn't communications between them. So it's really important that organizations should work together in the incident response, both within the organization and when you're looking outside your organization. And this might seem like something that, of course, is true, that incident management is based on risk management, but sometimes organizations get so siloed that they don't even see that managing, risk is done outside of the risk department. Talking about preparedness, incident management requires you to be prepared, and it's suggested that you use an all-hazard approach, looking at both natural and human-induced incidents, and including those which the organization hasn't experienced in the past. Sometimes we get limited in our thinking and only planning for those things that are likely to happen or that have already happened to us. Information sharing is really important. In fact, there's a whole guidance document under ISO 2232, I don't remember which number it is, that talks about information sharing and how to best go about doing that. And that's usually between agencies and things. But I think that the components of it make sense for any organization. And incident management requires the sharing of information. It can't all be held by one or two people. And this idea of different perspectives we're going to explore some more today as well. Of course, safety first. We need to be looking at if an incident involves people's lives, that we need to make sure that we are managing that first. But as you know, reputational incidents probably aren't going to damage somebody's life. So we also need to be looking at all types of incidents in our incident response. Something that you're going to hear more and more about is this idea of being adaptable, being agile. When looking at organizational resilience, this idea of agility, adaptability, and scale, and being flexible, all is key parts of that, and that's also part of the principles of incident management, that you need to be flexible. We all know that what we've planned for isn't exactly what happens, and so you have to take what you've planned for and modify it and adapt it to meet the requirements of that incident. We also need to take into account human and cultural factors. If you're managing an incident in your organization, even in the United States, how things operate in New York are very different than how things operate in Texas and how things operate out in California, much less when you're looking at different countries and different continents and how cultural factors need to be taken into account. And of course, with any standard, they always want to focus on continual improvement and the importance of getting better at what you're doing. Incident management should also consider different factors, and of course one of those is your facilities, also the equipment within those facilities, the personnel that run those facilities, the organizational structure as a whole, how does it operate, what kinds of procedures that you need to have in place, as well as how you're going to be communicating those. So each of these factors is very important to consider, and this really, it's predicated on the understanding that in any and every incident, there are going to be certain management functions that should be carried out regardless of the number of people who are available or involved in the responding to the incident. And these are factors that should be part of that. So just to look at a real high level on incident planning, your incident plans may be generic or be for specific risks. And what we normally see in incident management plans will be, we have these general procedures, and then we know these things are going to happen because they've happened to us in the past. So you'll have specific plans that respond to specific threats or risks, like an intruder or a tornado. Mostly they're with weather-related risks and things that are caused by people, usually dealing with life safety types of things. Your plan should also be available when you need it, and can be a standalone plan or can be an annex to another plan. So when you look at, for example, ISO 27001 and information security, you're required to have incident response as part of that, and you could have it as a separate plan or part of your overall incident response. The same thing applies to the business continuity standard, ISO 22301, where you just need to have an incident response structure in place. And again, that can be a separate plan, or it can be something that is part of everything else. And then, of course, we all know that everybody who's assigned a role should be informed that they have a role and that they need to understand their duties and what they're supposed to do well in advance of an incident. So let's take a look next at incident management plan content. Some of this, I hope, is redundant for you, and it's something that you're saying, yes, I understand that. Yes, we already do that. That's really my hope for most of this plan content. And as a takeaway, if there's something in here that you're not doing, that you can look to improve your incident management or your incident response plan. So every type of plan should have a stated purpose, should have a scope and the objectives. And of course, this should be consistent with what your plans are about. It should have a set of conditions that should require activation of the incident response and a process to activate that. And I'm going to talk more about this. This is usually the biggest problem, is that people don't activate their plans until the incident's really gotten to be overwhelming, and that they could manage it much better if they've activated it earlier. So understanding when to activate is very important. And if nothing else, I think this is one of the most important aspects to your plan. Obviously, we need roles and responsibilities. You need to know, what organization it's related to and who's going to be staffing some of those things. What kinds of things are you doing to protect your organization? So what are those protective actions? What kind of warning systems do you have in place? How are you going to interface with and support between different organizations? How are you going to notify your different stakeholders, your interested parties? And what points of contact are going to be available at all times? You should have, if you have relationships with other organizations, you need to have agreements with them so that everybody's very clear on who's doing what. There should be a very specific communications for this, as well as the information in your plan should flow in a manner that it's usable. You should have identified your critical facilities and what kinds of resources you need to support that. And then talking more about this activation aspect, sometimes we call them escalation plans, so how you might move from one category to another in the activation. So, an incident might start at one level and grow to another level, and how you're going to notify people within those, and how you're going to do those incident assessments, and how you're going to classify those incidents. So really looking at the level of impact and how, it might be a financial impact. It might be a time, how long something lasts. It might be how much it's hurting us reputationally. Whatever those types of incident classifications become very important in understanding when to activate and when to use your plans. There should be some predetermined activities. So what is it that you're going to be doing? What are your procedures? for each of those incident categories, and documentation of decisions made and steps taken in response to the emergency. And I've been teaching business continuity types of things for many years, and all of the standards talk about the fact that you need to document decisions made and actions taken. And in doing the interview, yesterday I had an interview with one of the responders. At the school, they're still in incident response. They're still in recovery mode because they're still working from an alternate site, and they feel that they're going to be in recovery mode for another year while their school's being built and being rebuilt. And so I asked about, could you share some of the documentation of what the decisions that you've made? And there was a silence. And the answer was, yeah, I think I can find it, but we're still so busy just, running our normal business, trying to be business as usual as much as possible at our alternate site, as well as planning, for the new building and making all the decisions with that we really haven't had a chance to document things. And she felt that she could get that information, but that it wasn't readily available. So I don't want you to underestimate how difficult it is to document decisions along the way, and that if you don't plan for that ahead of time, it is going to be very difficult for you to pull it together afterwards, and then you might miss things and things that are really important for you. So that should be something that you should be considering. When we're looking at incident response procedures specifically, there's some key requirements for an effective response. One, like I've mentioned, one is the ability to recognize and assess existing and potential threats when they occur, and to be able to determine an appropriate response. So understanding, is this something we need to respond to? Is this something we need to start planning for? I threw out that satellite thing kind of as a future threat, but is that something your organization needs to be planning for now or not? And that's really a decision that you need to discuss with your leadership team. Is this something that matters to us? And then, does everybody understand the procedures for activation, escalation, and control? And having responsible personnel with the authority and capability to implement the agreed upon procedures needs to be very important. And this is where you often see a disconnect, is that people have been assigned responsibility and they're capable of doing it, but maybe they haven't been given the proper authority. And we see this most often with financial authorities. So they've been given the responsibility and authority to activate a plan, which means you need to activate certain strategies that you may have in place, but you don't actually have the financial authority to activate that strategy. So that's where often we see gaps in people's procedures, that they don't have, they have business as usual type of spending authority, but they haven't that hasn't been modified during an incident response. There's no way to say more that the ability to communicate effectively before, during, and after an incident is one of the most important aspects of an incident response, as well as having access to sufficient resources to actually implement those procedures as needed. And you can achieve these things by many different methods, and that's why there's no cookie cutter answer to these. We have ways and we have best practices for how you might implement things, but the reality is that every organization is different, and so they need to be suitable to the needs of the organization. So how a school implements something is going to be very different than how a bank implements something, which is going to be very different than how a manufacturer implements. And so I think we see more consistently between different types of organizations, like financial institutions, manufacturers, sales and marketing type of things, as well as more the public sector aspects. But, we can learn from each other, but they need to be suitable to your organization. I use this graphic for a lot of things. We need to understand different perspectives, and they need to, you see the person on the island so excited to see the boat, and you see the person in the boat so excited to see land. And it's one of the things that you should strive to understand is other perspectives, both within and outside your organization, and looking at different response scenarios and how people might have different perspectives on what's best for the organization They might have different needs, even within your own organization, on what you need, and there might be a challenge and a conflict between people wanting something at a certain time period, and that might be in conflict. And then you have to also understand within your own organization, you're going to have different objectives as well as different cultures when you're dealing with a multinational organization. And just also understand that when you have an incident, people are going to be interpreting that incident from different perspectives based on their own mission, operations, and capabilities. So some parts of your organization are going to be looking at the reputational impact. Others are going to be looking at the financial impact. Still others are going to be looking at, how are we going to meet our contracts and legal requirements. So it's very important that each of those perspectives has a voice and that they're heard by the leadership team to make sure that you have a very good picture of what's happening. And also understanding that, different parts of your organization are going to have different mandates and responsibilities as well. And don't forget that how incidents are viewed by the public also depends on how the details are communicated to them. So when you're looking at your own communications, you obviously want to communicate the best light for your organization, but making sure that sometimes different perspectives lead to conflict. And they can stem from, when you have these different interests and you're looking at achieving completely different things, where does that conflict lie, and understanding what that is. And when you have different perspectives, sometimes that's going to draw to a conflict. The other thing to really consider is the importance of time. And you can see, in the figure here, they're fighting over that clock. And that really is an important aspect for you to consider, because you need to anticipate what they're calling here cascading effects, or things that move from one thing to another, that all of a sudden the problem was small and now it's grown to be a big thing, either because of how the incident has grown or maybe by the fact that you haven't acted in a manner that slowed it down. So here's where we talk about the importance of taking initiative to do something sooner rather than later. One of the examples that we have here in the United States is when we had Superstorm Sandy. Everybody knew it was coming. It was forecasted. It was in the news. People made plans on how they were going to respond. But many companies didn't actually activate their plans until after the storm hit. And then it was too late, because the services that they had contracted with were no longer available to them, because other organizations, it was a regional incident. It impacted everyone, and so therefore the service providers that they contracted with weren't available. So, we talk about being on the ball, taking initiative sooner rather than later. Don't wait too long to activate. Consider other organizations' timelines. If you think that your response is going to be impacted by the fact that other organizations are going to be responding before you and taking over those resources, that's something you want to consider. The other piece of this is looking at the impact of different timelines within your own organization as well. So understanding, in the business continuity space, your different recovery time objectives, your different maximum tolerable period of disruptions, and what that looks like for the different disciplines within your organization. And you might need to modify your timeline accordingly based on these different things. And then the organization needs to also consider the needs and effects in both the short and long term. So these are the things we need to do immediately, but we're also going to need to be considering long term how that's going to develop. So how is that incident going to develop long term? What do we think are different needs that might arise? And how long do we think it's going to take us to meet these needs? So understanding, we're looking at the short term. Right now, what do we have to do? But what do we also have to do to make sure that we're positioned in the long term? So we're going to, bullet number 2, take initiative, actually becomes the topic of the next part of this, which is be proactive, act now. You need to be actively assessing risks and align the response to increase the effectiveness of your response. You need to be anticipating how incidents might change and how you might use incidents use your resources effectively. And then make decisions concerning those various measures early enough for decisions to be effective when they're actually needed, and don't wait too long. By the way, the waiting too long is usually caused by the fact that your plans aren't adequate. And I'm using that usually kind of casually, but meaning that, you can't make a statement because you haven't developed draft statements that have been approved by legal. So all of a sudden you've got legal telling you to stop, and you're trying to make decisions and move forward with communicating, for example, but you're being held up by legal. So, the communications aspects, it's really important to have those draft statements developed early on and approved so that you can just modify those. You need to manage the incident early. And, if you're in a response piece that's going to require a joint response, so response between multiple organizations, response between your organizations and the community, the government, emergency responders, it's better for you to initiate that joint response instead of waiting for someone else to do it. That way you're in control of what's happening, and you're not just the receiver of decisions that have already been made. Find out what information is being shared and what is actually being required to be shared, as well as you need to inform and instruct all those people that are involved, and maybe you need to build up new resources, for example. They've also identified some tasks. So in incident management, the incident command can be an individual or a group responsible for all incident activities, including the development of strategies and tactics and the ordering and release of resources. And the incident command has overall authority and responsibility for conducting incident operations, and they're also responsible for the management of the tactical operations at the site of the incident. And so we're going to be talking about some different incident command aspects, but the first thing that you really need to do is to establish your incident command and an internal organizational structure. So this is at each level of command. So you may have when you're talking about teams, everybody has teams as part of their incident response. So you may have an incident command aspect of each one of those teams, and then those team leaders or those incident commanders need to be reporting up to the teams above them as part of that org chart. They need to assess the risks in the affected area, whether that's a reputational risk or a physical risk. What are the objectives that you need to be having in place, and then how are you going to make decisions? So you have that, you've written your plans and you've got objectives of your plans and what you're trying to accomplish, but then you're going to need to look at the specific incident and decide, okay, what are the objectives of our immediate objectives to manage this incident, and what decision-making process are we going to use? Who's available to us out of our team of people who are supposed to be part of our team? Who's actually available to us? Again, I'll reference, the interview that I had yesterday, and they had like 12 people on their crisis management team, and only one of those persons was available to lead during that incident. And then they had one person that was part of their kind of adjunct team that was also available. So you never know who's going to be available at the time of an incident. And so you need to be aware of who's available and then determine your decision-making process based on who's available. And using your objectives, create an action plan, and then organize a site and develop, what's our organizational structure going to be for managing this incident? How are we going to manage our resources? What's our operational picture here? What are we trying to accomplish? And then taking a look at the plans that you have and say, we've got things in place for this, but we're going to have to ad lib because we didn't plan for this particular thing to happen. If you need to have additional locations or facilities, how are you going to manage that? How you might have additional resources like trying to manage volunteers. How are you going to do that? Or people that weren't impacted by the incident who are available to help you. How can you take their knowledge and expertise and use them? Obviously, you're going to need logistics. You're going to need supplies and equipment. And, of course, don't forget to keep records. And depending on the scale of an incident, tasks may be combined. In a large-scale incident, you might need additional resources, or you might be able to get those allocated from other parts of your organization or from other organizations themselves. When you're looking at roles and responsibilities, we always talk about the fact that the organization should clearly define your roles and responsibilities of all the personnel and the operating procedures that they need to use. And of course, you should have at least one or more persons. Again, I gave an example of, they had like 18 people on their list, and only one was available. So making sure you have a backup to your backups to your backups, with the responsibility that who can identify your incident management objectives, who's been assigned to identify your legal and any other obligations that you might have, who can initiate and take responsibility to lead. What's that span of control going to be? So looking at your organizational structure itself, what does that span of control look like? And we'll talk more about that. And then being able to assign tasks to make sure that you start managing that incident. I just went online and took some pictures, of some sample incident command structures. I know that in the private sector that people are, not necessarily using the incident command structure, but I am seeing it used more and more often. And really the purpose of it is to create a chain of command within the ranks, and have an orderly line of authority. So who is doing what and who reports to whom. And this idea or these principles really provide clarity in reporting relationships and can help to reduce and eliminate confusion caused by having multiple conflicting directives, and making sure that when you have incident managers at different levels, that they should be able to control the actions of all the personnel under their supervision. So this is just an example. They talk about having an incident commander, having your public information officer, and this is a person that's supposed to interface with the public and the media, and you might call that your communications person. Also, liaison officer that maybe can liaison with, if you have emergency responders between your organization, that can be liaisoning there, as well as some kind of a safety person. You might, in the example of the school, they would use their nurse type of thing. So it just depends on your organization itself, how you want to organize your incident command structure. This is another picture that I found that I liked the picture. I don't necessarily agree with everything in it, but it was a nice picture. For example, they've got the planning division, their operations division. So instead of them calling it the team, they're calling it divisions. And they call it delivery versus logistics. You can call these things whatever you want, as long as each one of these teams understands their roles and responsibilities. So usually you're looking for someone to manage the planning aspects, looking at the logistics for who's supposed to do what and what needs to be done in the future. The operations people tend to look at the operational aspects of the incident itself. So looking for your action plans for that. And the logistics, managing what equipment do you need? Do we need to move personnel? And then your HR, your human resources, your administration and your finance aspects of this as well. I have used this back when I was consulting, and maybe you'd have 6 different groups there. So it's really up to the organization what they want to have and what matches best and what they want to name things and the work that does, that each one of those teams does. Resource management is a really important aspect as well. So when you're looking at, you need to have processes for categorizing, ordering, dispatching, tracking, and recovering resources. So there should be, obviously, you should have a comprehensive database of the current resources you have in place, as well as protocols to access, utilize, and then demobilize such resources when you're done. And the standard provides just a long list of examples of different resources that you should consider. Obviously, human resources, what people do you need? What kind of administrative help do you need? What kind of logistical help do you need? Do you need any sort of scientific support, like if you're doing something that impacts the environment, for example? Managing the registration and inquiries, people that are calling on your support lines. Do people need clothing, shelter, or food? Transportation needs. Making sure that you have power and electricity. So making sure you have water, power, electricity, all of those things that probably come from the community. Health services, do you need resources for psychological and psychosocial support after an incident? Dealing with resources that you might need for your employee health and safety. And then, of course, you know that this is going to cost you money. So where are you going to come up with the financial resources to manage the incident currently and then also recover from the incident? If your organization is one that can take advantage of volunteer organizations like the Red Cross or something like that, you should be thinking about how you might do that. And also looking with the local authorities in your, whether it's the police or fire, that make sure that you've developed relationships with those on the front end so that you know who to communicate with and they're familiar with who you are and what you do. When we're talking about span of control, so an underlying principle of incident management is the need to optimize the number of resources that you need and the number of resources being managed. So when you're looking at kind of normal business as usual, we look at, one incident commander or one manager to every 7 people who they respond to. And kind of the other rule of thumb is that during an incident, that number should be reduced to, somewhere between 1 and 5 or 1 and 2, but understanding that this is going to be very dependent on how many people you have available and what your organization structure looks like. Another concept that I think is really covered under organizational resilience a lot is this idea of people working together and about coordinating and cooperating both at different levels in your organization, horizontally and vertically, as well as when you have, your organization is comprised of multi-locations or you have multiple organizations responding. So looking at trying to commit to contributing and strive to achieving some kind of joint direction. You hear, joint task forces. It's kind of a military term and an emergency management term, but looking at, what kinds of direction are we getting from top management, and then making sure that everybody's agreeing on some common incident objectives, especially if you have more than one organization responding to an incident. Talking more about the need to work together, organizations that are familiar with other organizational cultures should be able to trust in others and work better together, but this takes time. It's not going to be something that happens right away. So this idea of getting people to collaborate, encouraging people to provide viewpoints based on their knowledge and expertise, doing this ahead of time. And if you're collaborative, this is one of the adverbs that's used in more resilient organizations, is that you're agile, you're collaborative, you're able to support each other, that when you work together, it helps to strengthen the overall group versus tear it apart. And also being really careful of conformity of thinking. And this is why it's important that you have different people with different perspectives working on their incident preparation, as well as in the planning aspects, as well as looking at during the incident response, because it's very careful to do that kind of groupthink thing where everybody thinks it's a great idea because you're all of the same viewpoint and you're all looking at it from the same direction. So you need to be able to build trust up between the people responding as well, and so that people are knowledgeable and adapt to other organizations' culture codes, habits, and rituals. Being familiar with the different hierarchies within different organizations and how you manage the kind of the power struggles within that, as well as, having people who are sensitive enough to be able to have an instinctive feel for things that might promote fear. Stress promotes fear in people. Some people respond to being afraid or uncomfortable with being angry, and it's sometimes not easy to control your own emotions when you're having it when you're in the middle of this. It's easier to get angry. It's harder to think. People talk about, my adrenaline rush will help me through. Well, that might help you through for a bit, but it doesn't help you through for very long. So looking at the decision-making process, you need to have a clear and transparent decision-making process, and that your decisions need to be communicated within the organization to other involved organizations as well as the public where appropriate, which ties us to really seeing the whole picture. And this is like the boat and the island picture. I also really like this picture of the elephant, and it's been around forever. But you need to look beyond the scope of your own operations to consider and understand the overall incident management objectives. So if you're, looking at the tail, tail of the elephant versus the trunk of the elephant, you're different. Looking at your job is to make sure that your realm of responsibility is taken care of. But the fact is that you might not have the whole picture. So this is why it's really important for each part of the organization to be communicating to an incident command who understands the entire picture and that can form a more comprehensive perspective. And, if you're looking at how the course of the incident and your response is going to impact your entire organization, not just the part that's being impacted as well, it becomes very important. And so somebody needs to prioritize and weigh the different various interests and how those things really link to your core objectives and what you're trying to accomplish. And this is really easier said than done, but it's something that you need to be aware of. I'm not going to spend much time on the fact that you need to have on-site and off-site command posts. Somebody needs to be aware of what's going on site, and there needs to be people working off-site to also make decisions and manage that as part of that whole incident command. And I also want you to consider the fact that there could be concurrent incidents happening. And we saw this in Japan, where the tsunami actually caused a lot more damage than just the flooding. We saw this in Superstorm Sandy in the U.S. We saw this in Katrina. It really was what happened after the hurricane that caused the most problems. So when you're managing concurrent incidents at multiple levels, make sure that you've got a way to communicate so that you avoid duplication, and making sure things stay in a timely way, making sure you anticipate that other organizations may assess the situation in a different way, as well as identify situations or cascading effects that might really help, that might impede or delay agreements and appropriate actions. So this is tied together with actively sharing information with other organizations and trying to be as precise as possible while maintaining the security of the information that you might need, trying to ensure that the information that you have is accessible to other organizations, again, while taking care to be secure in what you're providing, and then having a way to receive and analyze information obtained from other organizations, which really leads us to where we're going to be ending today, which is talking about communications. You need to make sure you've got effective communications coordinated both within and between organizations. It's important to make sure that you're credible, to prevent ambiguities, and to counteract the spreading of rumors. We have social media. It's usually out. Social media, somebody's posting something before you even know what's happened. Some people even find out about an incident through social media, and they haven't bothered to communicate that, to somebody in the organization, but they posted it on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. Making sure that you begin communicating as early as possible. Collaborate on that communication, listen to the needs of your target groups so that you can adapt your communication accordingly, and ensure that your communication is characterized by being fast, open, and accurate. So I want to finish up today with our final poll, and just looking at, after learning about ISO 22320 and its guidance on incident response, how mature do you think your organization's incident response capability is? So go about 5 more seconds. Looks like just about everyone has voted. And the results are really pretty much what I expected, that most people are either mature or somewhat mature. And that's because you have to have plans for life safety. So your organization has, is required to have certain things in place. So I would be really shocked if nobody had any sort of incident response capability. But I also think that it's going to be very difficult to work with other organizations. And I think that we're all challenged with just building up our own incident response capability within our individual areas of responsibility, and making sure that those are not siloed within our organization, and then begin looking outside. So I think that the results here make a lot of sense. So thank you for that. Just to conclude, our next webinar is on preserving, protecting, and recovering data. October is about understanding and protecting against security breaches. November is looking at resilient workforce. And then we had a reschedule of our March webinar, and it's rescheduled for December 12th, looking at reputation management. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. And just to remind you that we weren't able to get to the questions, so I will respond to any questions that you have, and I'll email everybody who attended today. And the webinar will be available to watch again if you'd like on our webinar page, probably by Friday, if not Friday, Tuesday, since we're closed on Monday. And you will be receiving a certificate of attendance. So thank you very much and have a great week. Goodbye.